This next panel is comprised of leaders from global organizations around the world thinking about these types of challenges. They're going to talk to us about the way they leverage open source tech in the delivery of public goods and where greater collaboration is needed to make an impact. Danelle Dixon, our CEO, is going to be leading this panel. And Danelle, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. The waffles in the office. It makes me laugh to think about it since I haven't seen them for so long. So I am so honored to have the panel that I have here and to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is open source. I am a big believer in open source technologies, and there's a lot of myths and challenges out there that people think about open source, but it's actually something that you can build on, you can generate revenue on, you can do you have lots of opportunities with respect to it. And I have a panel of experts here that can really share with us their view on open source from all different sectors in government, public sector, private sector. So let me introduce them. So I have Stella McCon, she's a manager in the Innovation Lab at the World Bank. Thank you, Stella. It's so nice to see you. I also have Irene Arias Hoffman, who is the CEO of IDB Lab of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you, Irene, for joining us. Lucy Harris, who we work together at Mozilla. She's now the co-lead of the Digital Public Goods Alliance. Thank you for joining us, Lucy. And Tomika Tillman, who is the founder and executive director of New America. So I'm so honored to have you all here. And thank you for joining us. And I just want to jump right into it. I'm going to start with, let's see, Stella. Why don't you talk about what does a decentralized collaborative technology and community look like to you, and how in your organization are you pursuing this goal? Because I know you guys have spent a lot of time on this.
Thank you, Danelle, and so great to see everyone, all our colleagues and partners on this panel. It's our strong belief that we really need to learn how we can design, build, deploy, and operate with open source technologies. There are still a lot of questions around how open source technologies behave, what kind of opportunities they can provide, especially in some of our client countries, which have different levels of digital maturity. So for us at the World Bank Group Technology and Innovation Lab, we've been exploring a lot in the last 3 years of emerging technologies, and we've been looking into all the aspects of the open source technologies. Specifically, we try to look at the decentralized nature of these emerging technologies. It's important for us to see how we can leverage them for transparency and efficiency, but also it's important for us to see how decentralized technologies can help us shape new service delivery models, especially in the public sector, but also in our own operations. We are a global organization with offices all around the world. And specifically now, since COVID kicked in, with all of us working remotely, we're also trying to see how we can leverage these decentralized technologies for, online digital by default operations. Another aspect of key interest for us is the collaborative nature of these technologies and how we can leverage them to build collaborative grassroots innovative ecosystems. Again, especially in our client countries, how can we leverage these technologies to enable collective intelligence for problem solving, bringing all key stakeholders in this process. And of course, the topic that you've mentioned, to what extent open source enabled decentralized collaborative technologies can help us build platforms, digital platforms, and build global digital public goods. Another aspect which I would like to bring, which is of key interest for us, is the open source technology economics. We talk a lot about, the good aspects, but again, the economics is very important, especially when we are looking at leveraging open source in building the backbone of the digital infrastructure to power the digital economy, but also building the digital platforms and services for public service delivery. So very important topic. We need to continue educating ourselves and partners with whom we are working jointly with the technology ecosystem. And key important pieces for us is the decentralized nature, the collaborative nature of these technologies, and of course the economics of adopting these technologies. Over to you, Danielle.
That's so awesome. Thank you, Stella. I think one time we were on a call together on an issue and someone said, who owns these decentralized technologies? So it's obviously a question that gets asked all the time, and it's something that, you know, people don't always equate that to the web and how the underpinnings of the web works, but it's a similar thing. So Tamika, how is it that you are thinking about this at New America with all the organizations that you work with?
Well, it's a great question. A lot of our work is focused on the public sector and helping the public sector to operate more efficiently. There's an old saying that all governments have the same problems, but not all at the same time. And right now with the pandemic, we are living through a pretty unique moment in which all governments are having the same problem, and they're having the same problem at the same time. And what that means is there's a real opportunity to solve big challenges at scale and do so in a way that doesn't require the expensive duplication that exists around most of the public sector use of digital tools that we've seen in the past. What we've seen is that if governments can build really high quality 80% solutions that hardwire in accountability, efficiency, and transparency, then every community can customize the last 20% of those solutions to meet their own specific needs. And especially when you're talking about foundational tools like digital identity and digital payments, it unlocks vast new levels of efficiency and accountability that are really lacking in a lot of the work that goes on in the public sector right now. In too much of government, you have institutions that were designed in the 19th century using technology from the 20th century to try and solve the problems of today. And it's just not working out that well. So we need an upgrade for our democratic institutions. And what we see is that if you can address challenges like corruption and like tax evasion through the use of tools that provide for greater accountability and efficiency, you free up enough money in principle to pay for all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Well over $5 trillion a year are lost to those two problems alone. So it's hard to overstate the stakes when it comes to what we can do if we get these problems addressed and use open source technology in the process.
No, it's so true. And the notion of that last mile and focusing on the regional, allowing the regional development, because it's really there that you see the innovation based on their needs. So I love that focus. And I do think that open source tools allow you to do that. So how about you, Lucy? I know that you guys are constantly looking at digital goods and how you can develop that more and get that more out into the public. So tell me what that looks like for your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about decentralized collaborative technologies and communities, we do think about it through the lens of digital public goods, which are open source software, data, or content that help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So has that kind of additional component beyond open source. And at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is an initiative co-led by UNICEF and the government of Norway, we work to promote digital public goods that we think are critical for creating a more equitable world. And our approach is very much based in our open source roots, so being transparent and collaborative, and it's why the Digital Public Goods Alliance is an alliance. Our goal is to work with many stakeholders to help identify and support high potential open source projects, and also to work to create really healthy ecosystems that support the creation, adoption, and implementation of digital public goods.
That's phenomenal. I think that to think about it from that standpoint and all of the ideas out there, again, like if you can get these public goods out there and get them digitized and easy to access, it's a pretty awesome opportunity. Irene, how about you? Last but not least, in terms of this question, at least, how does it work for your organization and your pursuit of the goals that you have?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle, and thank you everyone at the Stellar Development Foundation, and by the way, to the team also behind the scenes making this event happen. The onboarding has been great, and it's really great to be with Lisa, with Tamika, and also Stella, who's such a great partner, and Lucy. The Inter-American Development Bank Group, as you probably know, is the largest provider of development finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. Within the umbrella of the group, we have 3 entities: the public arm, the private arm, IDB Invest, and the IDB Lab, which is the part that I run. IDB Lab is the innovation lab, and basically our role is to promote innovation ecosystems in the region. We're the largest investor in venture capital in the region among the multilaterals. And through that, our core mission is innovation for inclusion. We want to create a more inclusive region. And this has led us to develop, I think, the strong conviction that we all share here of the potential that open source has to unlock value and to create new solutions that are truly much more efficient, more transparent, more collaborative, more inclusive. I think what Tomika said earlier reminded me of, in terms of the problems that we're facing these days, reminded me of another phrase, which is, we have not succeeded in answering all our problems. The answers we have found only serve to raise a whole set of new questions. In some ways, we feel we are as confused as ever, but we believe we are confused on a higher level and about more important things. And it just reminded me of that phrase, because at the end, we never want to lose focus of the real problems on the ground that we're trying to solve. And I think, Daniel, you referred to that. And these include, for example, the fact that we still have more than 40% of population in many rural areas in Latin America and the Caribbean without any access to financial services. And at the same time, in the last few months, we've seen an incredible amount of people gaining at least temporary access. More than 11 million in Colombia, 76 million people in Brazil have been able to open an account to receive support for COVID emergency as part of social programs for COVID emergency. What an opportunity not to leave that as a one-off. What an opportunity to bring that into these kinds of platforms where you can actually build the future of what is an economic passport for people that were previously excluded. This is exactly why we're here, what we're working on. And one of the ways we've done it is by building LockChain. LockChain started 2 years ago, and it's a global alliance for the development of the blockchain ecosystem in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have almost 30 partners working together, contributing with cash, with in-kind resources to develop the community and the infrastructure in the region. And it really has been an amazing journey. It's allowed us to develop what is today the largest public permission blockchain network in the world, with more than 25 projects going on in different sectors, with a strong focus on social and financial inclusion, and with some of the partners that are around here. So thank you for having us, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, so I love the idea, everything that you just said, and everyone that just said it really brings to bear what we're trying to do here in terms of just really use the technology and use a platform to be able to allow others to develop the innovative and creative tools that they need in their regions. And so Stella, Irene was just mentioning LockChain. And if you think about blockchain technologies, I know that your group has spent a lot of time looking at blockchain, public permissionless blockchain as well as permissioned. But yet I think that from a government standpoint, we still see some hesitancy for governments to be able to jump into this because they're fearful, and maybe even institutions are fearful of it because they don't maybe understand the technology, or it's just they feel like it's a big leap for them. What do you think it's going to take for us to be able to move this forward, especially from a permissionless open network that is open source?
Thank you, Danielle. I think building on what Irene has just shared with us, it's very important for us to keep learning from each other and decrease the time and cost of reinventing the wheel, to avoid reinventing the wheel. Try to build on each other's efforts. From our own exploration with blockchain, and we've also worked with Stellar Foundation and looked into how blockchain can help us improve traceability and visibility into our own World Bank loans disbursement. So this learning is very important for us, and we are sharing it with our client countries and with other teams across the bank and with other colleagues in the ecosystem. So keep learning, keep exploring around the problems that are not answered, because we have also observed that sometimes everyone is trying to experiment with this technology, trying to tackle the same problem or the same from the same angle. We could probably organize all these challenges like in three buckets. Challenges related to the digital maturity, but we have been observing either at the organizational level, sectorial level, or country levels. Yeah, in many countries, some of our clients are still missing important pieces of the government of the all infrastructure. To what Tomaika mentioned, the identity layer, the data exchange layer, a lot of data is not digitized, yeah? It's not properly secured, and even access to internet, high quality internet is a problem. So looking into how does blockchain technology fit into different types of services, infrastructures, capabilities that are built with 20th century technologies is critical. So here we run into the problem of interoperability between blockchain and other legacy technologies, blockchain and other emerging converging technologies. The second bucket is probably per se around the maturity of the technology. Yeah, we experimented mainly with the private permission blockchain, but to what extent the ecosystem is again working together to make sure that whatever challenges there might be at the technology level are being addressed and are being properly explained to the future consumers, either they are in the private or public sectors. And then the third bucket, which is probably not as important as the technology and the digital maturity, is about institutions. It's about policies. It's about the skills. Yeah? So sometimes you have the platform ready, you have the client ready to adopt it, but the certain legal, institutional, regulatory pieces are missing, and this is of course impacting how fast we can adopt it. I think it's important for us to look at the standardization. This is another challenge. Many organizations, including our colleagues from the World Economic Forum, have looked into this space, the ITU and other big partners. But again, to what extent we can join efforts and make sure that we are not working on similar challenges and we are sharing with each other the key results, the key learnings, so that we can move forward faster. I'll stop here. Thank you, Danelle.
Thank you, Stella. We certainly did enjoy, and we continue to enjoy, the relationship that we have with the World Bank. We think that for us to be able to demonstrate the power of what an open permissionless blockchain can do to get the loans from the World Bank all the way down to the farmer in a very streamlined way is a really important thing. But so Lucy, I want to jump into this for you. For the government to adopt and for institutions to adopt open source technologies that increase performance but they have to protect their constituents as well. So this is kind of a two-way relationship between institutions and developers. So what are some of the hurdles that institutions face when it comes to adopting open source? I mean, I mentioned one earlier when I talked about, sometimes when it's an open source, like a decentralized network, a question will be, well, who owns it? Who's responsible for it? Like that kind of thing. So what is your experience with that?
Absolutely. And you touched on that. And then Stella touched on another one around institutional pieces being missing. And I think there are kind of three main hurdles that I see for both institutions and developers around building and adopting open source. The first is, I think, to touch on what you said, a lack of awareness around open source. The second is kind of missing processes. And the third is missing support systems. So when I say lack of awareness about open source, I think it can be easy to forget when you live in this world, but that it's still relatively unknown for a lot of people, including in public institutions. and even among some developers who may have come across it, but they don't have a deep understanding of what it would actually take to build or work with an open source technology. The good news is I think open source is becoming more mainstream and better understood, and having the tools to advocate and increase awareness of open source is going to be key over the next few years to capitalize on the momentum I think we're already seeing around kind of increased awareness and understanding.
Yeah, go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. The second, I think, touching on what Stella said around like processes, is that many of us know that when you're implementing an open source project instead of a proprietary one, it's very different. And an analogy I really like is the difference between building a house from scratch or buying one on the market, where there are major advantages to getting to design and build your own house or to customize a local implementation of an open source project. But you're working with kind of a very different process. You're talking directly to architects and builders and electricians versus going through the kind of more standard process. And even though both have their own challenges, I think especially in the public sector, many institutions don't have the systems in place to support open source procurement. And that means when they decide to work with an open source technology, they have to figure out those processes for the first time as part of that engagement. And I think that's a big hurdle where we could do a lot to support. And even for developers, there's a piece there where, you know, they may be really excited about the concept, but when it comes to realizing that to build something open source, they have to choose a license, they have to figure out how to build a healthy community. There are big challenges there. And the last one I'll touch on just briefly is missing support systems. I think traditional pathways for receiving support from others, whether it's donors, investors, or accelerators, aren't designed to support open source. Luckily, I think there's actually a lot of new and emerging sources of funding and support for both institutions and developers in this area. One example is UNICEF's Venture Fund, which is a $30 million fund specifically aimed at helping innovators in low and middle income countries develop open source solutions. But I think those three are the major hurdles. And I think the good news is that there's lots of really great solutions and progress happening in this space from a lot of people in this room and other organizations. And these are definitely places where the Digital Public Goods Alliance is going to be putting our focus over the next year.
Love the analogy to the architect and the building the home or buying a home that's already built. Tamika, what are some of the strategies that the public sector can employ to further education that clarifies misconceptions around open source so that we can be able to leverage the tools more? And number two, discover and hire talent that's familiar with open source software, integrations and data standards, because standards are really key to this.
Well, it's a great question, and Lucy, I think, put out some excellent answers. We, earlier this year, released a big report called Building and Reusing Open Source Software in Government, specifically because in talking with our public sector partners, we recognized that this was a huge challenge, and they didn't necessarily have the toolbox that they needed in order to be able to leverage these new solutions effectively. We see a couple of pretty basic things that can help move governments in the right direction. The first is you should have policies on the use of open source software, and your software should be open source by default. There may be some rare circumstances in which you need to use a proprietary solution, but when that is not the case, you should be, to Lucy's point, procuring open source solutions as the default. You really should be making sure that you're addressing misconceptions around security and open source software. Many organizations have, over time, gained the belief that open source software isn't as secure as proprietary software. That's just not the case if you look at the actual numbers and the research that's been done on this. But that perception is still pretty widely spread across government. You need to have people within your organization, as you mentioned, that understand open source tools and know how to use them. And you also need to be able to document your work when you're developing open source solutions so that others will be able to take those innovations that you have built out within your organization and apply them effectively across other geographies and other communities. So we see a number of emerging best practices in this space. We've tried to codify those, and there are other great organizations that are doing the same thing. And the good news is we're making progress. There has been a very tangible shift in the conversations we have with policymakers over the last few years in the right direction. So don't give up. We're getting there.
I love that. It's one of the things that's so funny. One of the other misconceptions is that you can't generate revenue if you have an open source project because you don't own the IP. And I will just say, I will point back to Mozilla, and Mozilla generates a really strong amount of revenue, and it's an open source project completely. So it is one of the other misconceptions.
Danelle, if I could
Irene,
just throw out one more quick point, there's
please.
also a feeling that if you use open source, if you have a problem, there's nobody to talk to. And this is an area where, again, the developer community can make a real difference to the extent the communities that support open source tools grow, and to the extent we have great companies that are willing to work on those open source tools, we can address that misconception.
Yeah, that absolutely is true. Irene, and when you first joined IDB Labs, you made it a point to invest more smart capital into early stage startups across LATAM and to build more innovative solutions. So given your experience growing a team of experts in financial inclusion, how have you encouraged adopting new technologies rather than relying on the legacy systems? Because a lot of new technologies do focus on open source.
Yeah, no, thank you. So our investment arm at IDB Lab is specialized in investing pre-seed to Series A, Series B. And we do it through venture capital funds. We've invested in more than 90 venture capital funds in the last 27 years since inception, but also increasingly more also directly. And the reason for doing that is precisely to go a little bit deeper into some of the ones where we think that more mainstream commercial investors may be a little bit less sure about the models, and where we may be able to step in a little more to accelerate the maturity and the growth of those particular companies in certain industries. Just to give you a sense, the venture capital industry today in Latin America and the Caribbean is about $4.5 billion a year. It could easily be $120 billion if it just reached marginally the levels of equivalent ecosystems in other parts of the world, like Korea. And a lot of the growth, it's going to come from companies that understand what we're talking about here. Just digital services could be an industry of 80, 100 billion in the region. So we do look for those role models, and we also look for companies that are willing to that adopt this mindset and adopt this and are consistent in the application of digital development principles, which of course go into a lot of the things that that Lucy, Tomika, and Stella talked about. And now, in terms of maybe touching on what Stella mentioned on how to make sure that what we invest in, especially because it's early stage, it can be transformative and can really be something that's done at scale. Oftentimes, it depends on the whole ecosystem to be ready, and that includes public policy, that includes a lot of other institutions. We just, for example, have a new use case in Peru on blockchain for property records with K-Trust. It involves, it's not just the technology is the easiest part of it, it's the whole ecosystem to work together. And so on educating counterparts, and I think that there is a lot that we can do together, and part of it has included, for example, writing about self-sovereign identity as one of the main pillars underpinning anything to do with open source. We just published a book about it, and this has been a great tool to start educating counterparts around this. Happy to go into some of the examples. There are some really great examples of how all these different counterparts have to work together to make it happen, like digital identity together with digital wallets for Buenos Aires' poorest population in Villa 31, one of the slum areas. But it's not done in a vacuum. It's done within a larger program that had everything, including by the World Bank and IDB public site renovation of the entire neighborhood. So it's a little bit, I think it's collaboration at its best. It sounds complex, but I think we can. I'm also, like Tomika, very optimistic that we can get there.
Well, I love the idea of ending on the term of collaboration, because I feel like that's what open source technology is all about. That's what it is in terms of, I always think about open sources, you put it out there and you know that someone actually is going to use it and make it even better. And from my standpoint, and to focus on the regional needs of folks all over the world, which is what we try to do here at SDF. All of you are doing that in your work. I'm so grateful for the work that you guys do. And I'm so happy that we've been able to work together, and I look forward to doing more together in the future, and to pushing these standards and this openness out there for the world so that we can even develop stronger and stronger capabilities. Thank you so much for your time, for joining us here at Meridian, and for your attention to these matters. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Danelle.